every time I think about him, he's just got this. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Narrative Live. We're doing a very exciting thing today. We're talking to Tara Palmieri of the Red Letter. You all know her for incredible work that she's done with the Epstein survivors. And we're cross-pollinating today. Just before we got on, we spoke about how we both come at Jeffrey Epstein from different perspectives, different parts of his life. And it's so interesting to have this opportunity with you, Tara, to just to compare notes, really, on this guy who had so many faces, who had, there was the espionage face, there was the, the human trafficker face, there was the rapist, there's the organized criminal, supposedly this incredible financial tax expert, all these things. Yeah.
Zev,
yeah.
Your mic is distorted.
It is.
So what I'm hearing is also what other people are
Okay, I'm going to do something really loud then. I'm sorry. Give me a second. Does that make it any better? Is that better?
Not really. No.
Okay, then I'll try this. That's just a regular old microphone. Does that work?
I think it's better for sure.
Okay. All right. We'll just use the old school. So I'll start again a little bit here, but I was just talking about the many faces.
Why don't we start again from the top for everybody who's
pretend everything never happened to everybody. We'll just brand new here.
Thanks for everyone has actually stuck around for all this. Okay, you start from the top, though.
Yeah, I'm just very excited to speak to Tara Palmieri today. Many of you know her from the Red Letter. She's done incredible work on the survivors of Jeffrey Epstein. I've been doing work in a different way about Jeffrey Epstein at Narativ. We've been talking a lot about the financial crimes. And what's great about today is that Tara and I get to compare notes about this man and this criminal history that he has, which is quite baffling to me. I mean, it seems endless, the amount of things we're discovering about him. And as I was just saying, there are just so many faces of Jeffrey Epstein. There are people know him as the rapist, as the human trafficker, as the abuser, but he's also, of course, a financial expert, or claimed to be. He was also a financial criminal. He was an espionage guy. He worked for many espionage agencies. So this is it's really great to be able to see this from a different perspective. Tell me a little bit more about the Jeffrey Epstein that you know.
Yeah, I mean, I've obviously spent a lot of time with the survivors of Jeffrey Epstein, particularly Virginia Giuffre, and I've seen it from the perspective of these young girls who were exposed to this life of not just extreme privilege, but power, and some of the most powerful people in the world, and were tossed around like party favors. But, for some reason, that doesn't seem to compel the most powerful people in our country to do anything about it. I mean, we hope that there will be a new congresswoman from Arizona, Grijalva, Adelita Grijalva. She'll be sworn in, and they'll maybe start the process of compelling the DHS to release the files. I am skeptical that we will see anything that is not highly redacted, like what you see already on the FBI vault. But in the meantime, I do think the drip of information about Jeffrey Epstein, whether it's through emails that have been leaked, whether it's from the estate having to comply with subpoenas from the House Oversight Committee, and whether it's just from investigations, like from the Senate Finance, to find out, why was this man so protected? How was he able to get away with one of the largest sex trafficking operations in history? And, some of the latest reporting is really shocking to me. Bloomberg has a piece out about how federal prosecutors opened a money laundering investigation into Jeffrey Epstein at the same time that they were investigating him for child sex trafficking. And he was genuinely worried about that. He thought he could get away with the sex trafficking, but he was worried about the money laundering. And then Alex Acosta made the decision not to pursue that angle, which seems very clear cut. Like, a money laundering case is not that the child sex trafficking operation wasn't clear cut. I think it was very, very overwhelming, the evidence they had. The lead prosecutor thought that he should be charged on more than 60 counts. But this is also incredible to know that he had another angle of criminality, and he still let this guy go with a sweetheart deal. So I was hoping to talk to you more about that, what you know. And it seems so, and also just, how is he able to get access to some of the wealthiest people in America, some of these people who are running legitimate financial institutions, like Mark Rowan at Apollo and Jess Staley at JP Morgan, Glenn Dubin, who had this huge hedge fund as well, like Les Wexner, who was, head of L Brands, which was Victoria's Secret billionaires. Why would they give a college dropout their money? Was it
Right.
KGB style? Were these girls being used as honeypots in
They
KGB
really
style?
were. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the sense that I got from all of it, was that they were being used as honeypots, and that perhaps the intelligence that he got from these wealthy individuals was valuable to various governments, and that's how he was protected. But that is based on some of my reporting,
Yeah.
having, found, learned that his bodyguard would go to Langley for him. Why does he get access to Langley? It all seems to me like he had some value to the government, and I don't think it was just in the United States. I think he was probably valuable to multiple governments. And apparently, according to Vicky Ward's reporting, he used to brag that he was advising Vladimir Putin, African dictators. He was very good friends with Ehud Barak, who used to stay in his apartment. We know that Virginia Giuffre has said that she was trafficked to him. So I was hoping that you might illuminate my audience with some of the
Yeah.
reporting that you have about how he was able to commit so many crimes with among the most powerful people in the world, who saw him as not a risky person to be around.
I mean, that really is the big question around Jeffrey Epstein. For me, when looking at this, I came at this from a political angle because I wanted to see why he had such an incredible influence politically, especially in my investigation around Donald Trump. That's sort of where I found Jeffrey Epstein. I didn't go through any of the other routes. And it became very clear early on that Jeffrey and Donald Trump were really close friends, beyond close friends. Michael Wolff was on the other day. He said that probably for both Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump, they were the closest friendships or relationships they'd ever had. So they're not just best friends; they were the kind of best friends that really bonded with each other in everything. They did absolutely everything together, including business, and that to me was such an interesting piece of this. And one of the journeys I went, you just mentioned so many questions. Like the first question you asked was, why would these billionaires willing to do this for
Mm,
him? And the answer is partially blackmail. I mean, we know
mhm,
now that blackmail operation was pretty sophisticated, and it's even been confirmed by Howard Lutnick, who's the neighbor of Jeffrey Epstein, who went there at one point with his wife, he says he never went back because of the ickiness of the whole thing, and because there was, he saw that the blackmail's opportunity there for Jeffrey Epstein, so he never went back. But it's a lot about that. It's a lot about the leverage he had against them. But it wasn't only the blackmail, the girls and all that. That wasn't what was the only blackmail he had. He had other compromising blackmail. And one of the things he did with Jess Staley, I believe, is I'm looking more deeply into his role at Deutsche Bank. Jess Staley was one of the key executives at Deutsche Bank. Um, and he was able to compromise all these people politically too, because or criminally. The thing about the girls, for example, was it wasn't about having Andrew sleep with just another woman. It was to sleep with an underage girl. That was the key to their blackmail because they knew that they had him on a potential crime at that point, and he'd be much more usable if they had him on a potential crime. Otherwise, he would say, "Okay, yeah, so what? I had an affair, so whatever." But to say, you slept with an underage girl, that really would compromise him and something he couldn't deal with publicly because it was a felony, of course. And so he had that on people like Andrew. He had the same things financially on people and also operationally. So Jess Staley, turns out, was a bit of an operative. He seemed to take orders or undertake missions on behalf of Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein, in some ways, was his handler. And so when Jeffrey Epstein would tell Jess Staley to go do something, he would go do it and come back. Now, that is also compromising because just the very fact that JP Morgan waited until 2019, it's so unbelievable. They fired him as a client in 2013. but they only reported the suspicious activity reports in 2019. Now, why would they wait so long to file these suspicious activity reports? It's because they themselves were compromised. The bank itself was found compromised. We know they agreed to these settlements, although they didn't admit to any guilt, but they agreed to these settlements, which suggests that they were aware that they were part of an operation, a human trafficking operation, a criminal operation, a money laundering operation. And the case of the money laundering, I'm sorry, I'm going on for a bit here, but you asked so many great questions. The money laundering thing with Villafani, the person who came up with the plea bargain,
Prosecutor.
but yeah,
Yeah.
prosecutor. She launched the money laundering investigation on the back of the human trafficking operation because she was like, she had gotten information about it, but she was actually just trying to open up the case. She was trying to, and also to use that as leverage to get him to agree to some sort of plea deal, which he eventually did, of course. And the plea deal that he landed up getting, he was able to reduce to absolutely nothing, to just basically a small charge and house arrest. But that money laundering operation investigation, had it continued at that time, I think would have unearthed an enormous amount of crime, an enormous amount of criminal activity, and would, save not only these poor victims who were having such a hard time struggling with what he was doing to them. And every time I read one of those stories, it's just heartbreaking beyond belief. And it still boggles my mind how this presidency and this Justice Department cannot achieve what these women are asking for. It's so obvious what they need. They need closure, and they need to be respected, and they need these files to be released. And I like you, echo what you're saying about these files needing to come out. But this prosecution would have unearthed so much of that, would have unearthed so much financial crimes that all these people were colluding with. It was Epstein, it was also Trump, it was also the people at JP Morgan, it was also Leon Black. It's all these constellation of names that you mentioned, Wexner, everybody. They were all involved in these financial crimes.
Yeah. So the financial crimes that they were trying to, well, first of all, we know that JP Morgan was actually was Epstein's bank when he was paying various women and employees that were used in a sex trafficking operation. So, they were a conduit to a sex trafficking operation.
Oh, yeah.
They were like,
they funded it. They
they were the
financed it.
bank. Yeah, they financed it. After he returned from prison and was not prison, jail, county jail, because of sex trafficking, not, because it was a state crime, thanks to the sweetheart deal. They also kept him on as a client, even though he was a sex offender.
Yeah.
It was Jess Staley who really advocated for that. He really fought hard. And then, you see from the emails between Jess Staley and Epstein that clearly Jess enjoyed the lifestyle provided by Jeffrey Epstein. And that included, who would you like today, Snow White or Beauty and the Beast?
I
I'm
know.
having, I'm in your hot tub at the Zorro Ranch where Jeffrey Epstein wanted to literally breed humans. I'm in the hot tub with a glass of wine. That's the relationship was beyond cozy for a banker and their client, and he pressured top executives at the banks to keep Epstein as a client when most people would say, hell no.
Tara, that's exactly right. I mean, it's shocking to me. That is probably, as I'm writing this new series on Substack called The Greatest Heist 2, it looks at exactly that. It looks at why Jess Staley and others were so sympathetic to Jeffrey Epstein after his plea deal. There's a conversation between Mary Erdos, who's the private wealth CEO, and Jess Staley, who is also an executive at JP Morgan. And she's saying, oh, it's so heartbreaking. It's so sad about Jeffrey, and then he's saying, yeah, I saw him last night. He really denies all the ages, meaning he doesn't deny the charges, just the ages that were in question here. So he's sort of bragging about all that. And they sort of found that that was the defense that they were able to rest on, is that they took Jeffrey Epstein's word that these women were not underage. But what we're finding out is that they not only kept him on as a client, they actually accelerated the work that they did with him. They wanted even more business with him. They elevated him inside JP Morgan into this, into almost like a consultant and advisor to the senior ranks of JP Morgan. And he was sending Jess Staley on missions. The whole JP Morgan goes to China thing that was ordered by Jeffrey Epstein, and constructed by Jeffrey Epstein. There's all these detailed conversations where he's giving him cultural advice and saying what to ask the Chinese for. Why
But
is a
why?
client?
Yeah, but why would Epstein be someone who's seen as an expert on how to negotiate with the Chinese? Like, what does he know? Again,
Nothing. It really was beyond bizarre. I mean, unless he's a spy, which I believe he was, and I believe he was a spy for the Israeli military intelligence. I've several sources who've come on the record to say that for me. But that's the only thing that becomes clean about this is when you see him as a spy running a major intelligence operation that allows for all these possibilities. It allows for the human trafficking. It allows for him, getting these executives to do things for him operationally. It also allows for the capture of all these famous people. He was going around trying to capture not only politicians, but all these scientists, all these other people, and trying to, capture them, capture their brains, fund them, do whatever he can to own what they were doing. And then it went for the banks as well. It went for the presidents as well. A lot of the people that we see that went to the island were Democrats because they wanted to compromise Democrats. They were basically on side of the Republicans. So, that's why that's the only way I can think of that allows for all these different things, all these different faces of Jeffrey Epstein. And what I'm really curious from you is, did these, the survivors very, very well. Did they ever know that? Did they ever understand that they were being used as pawns in a blackmail operation, in a scheme that had huge global implications?
most of the girls know because they were kids. They didn't know any better. Like,
Mm,
they just had no idea. They just thought he was a rich guy who had really wealthy friends. And a lot of them didn't know even the people that they were being trafficked to.
oh, wow.
I was like, it's not like they're not like hanging out reading about Nobel Prize laureates, or you know what I mean, or
Yeah.
knowing who runs the media lab at MIT. You know what I'm saying? Not that he actually was a recipient, but you know what I'm saying. Like, they weren't reading academic journals. But it's interesting because the way you're putting it, like, if you did want to have control of a country, then you have, you stranglehold the leadership in finance, in science, in academia, in politics. You take all of the power centers and you control them by having blackmail on them. It's very KGB style in a way.
It is.
Um,
It is. And
yeah, and so it's
sorry.
interesting too with Jess Staley though. So when Jess was clearly losing power within JP Morgan, it was Epstein who helped Jess get a job at Barclays, that thing,
Yeah.
move on from there. And I think he was a CEO of Barclays. Yes, I believe that's right. And so he was not only, perhaps he was literally controlling their lives. He was a fixer for them. And it's interesting to see him as this like hyper operator, hyper fixer, which is also why I think, when you see that he met with the deputy Secretary of State, Bill Burns.
Mhm.
And people don't realize this, but state and CIA are very much connected. A
Was
lot of
Burns was CIA, wasn't he? I think
He
wasn't Burns
became
CIA?
CIA, but
Yeah.
not when they met. They met when he was
Okay.
Deputy Secretary of
That
State,
was
but he went
interesting.
on to be CIA under the Biden administration. At that
Okay.
time, he was Deputy Secretary of State. And, a lot of foreign diplomats, they're not diplomats, they're CIA.
Hmm.
And so I think people kind of underestimate how intertwined those two agencies are together. And when his schedule was FOIA'd, um, Freedom of Information Act, when they were compelled to hand over his schedule, it showed that he had 3 meetings with the CIA. And like I said, his bodyguard, Igor Zinoviev, went to Langley while he was in prison and in jail, and came back with a binder for Epstein to read. And so, I mean, that's his account that he told Brad Edwards, who's the lawyer for the victims, who told me. And I think it's just really, really interesting, all of these connections. And of course, everyone says he's a spy. I mean, the thing is, would how did he get his money? Like, why would Les Wexner be the origin of his money? Can
Yeah,
you explain that?
that's a huge question. Look, the way I explain that is through Wexner was a big supporter of the Israeli state and of
Mm,
Zionist causes. And you know, if Jeffrey Epstein was working for Israeli military intelligence, it explains a lot of connections in his life. Firstly, Ehud Barak, before he was prime minister, was the defense minister, or maybe even after he was prime minister, he was the defense minister. I'm not sure which way it went,
yeah.
but
Foreign minister too, as well.
yeah. And that defense ministry would have put him in charge of the Israeli defense forces, which had inside of it military intelligence, which is what Epstein worked for and Ghislaine worked for. People often call it Mossad, and it's a bit of a misnomer, and it's why the Israelis have been able to play a game with everybody. You know, on the one hand, they often come out and say, oh, Epstein was not part of Mossad. Well, he wasn't. He was part of Israeli military intelligence, Amman, two different organizations, but both spying organizations within Israel's, intelligence infrastructure. So the way I explain Wexner is through that. Some people say he and Wexner had an affair, had a
Yeah, I've
lifelong
heard that before.
relationship,
Yeah.
and that was really close, which, opens up a whole lot of questions around why Jeffrey Epstein, if he wasn't, exclusively interested in women, maybe not interested in women that much at all, why was he doing all this? And then, you land up back at well, he was a spy. He needed to do this. He needed to compromise people. I don't believe that it was necessarily one way or the other, but I think there was a gay aspect of Epstein's. Maybe it was a control aspect. Maybe it's more power aspect. Who knows what it was that he was using? But he had everyone who he seems to have come in contact with. It was Jess Staley included. Had this kind of oddly. Ellie Leonard, who's on the chat right now, was telling me last night that she thought out of reading all these emails that there was a connection between Jess Staley and Jeffrey Epstein that was kind of romantic. It was more than just a friendship. It was more like, at one point, Jess Staley says, I want to come and give you a big hug to Jeffrey Epstein while he's during house arrest, but was, obviously traveling around and doing things he shouldn't have done. I mean, that's a very unusual thing for an executive at a bank or even a friend. I think it's kind of the strangest kind of comment to say that I want to come give you a big hug for two guys. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's a little, it's
No,
possible, but
it is weird. And he introduced Les Wexner to his wife, Abigail.
yeah.
So he did a lot of things for these people and he knew a lot about them. And I think there were a lot of implicit handshakes going around about, hey, this could be socially embarrassing. And do you think he was willing to launder their money? I mean, that's another part of it.
Oh yeah, this is the thing that I find so fascinating about what Wyden came out with. The financial reports that he says J.P. Morgan had, and they finally have released these suspicious transactions or suspicious activity reports. There was $1.1 billion of suspicious activity. Now, Jeffrey Epstein did not have $1.1 billion. Even over the years, he did not. Maybe he had some of that throughout the years, but he died with $600 million, which is a lot of money anyhow. But what was all this other money that was flowing through these accounts? He was the number one client for private wealth, for J.P. Morgan Private Wealth. How did he get to be the number one client, getting $60 million of revenue just for the bank? That's a tenth of his total wealth at the time that he died. And what I reveal in The Greatest Heist is that he was obviously laundering large amounts of money that would create transaction fees. You go to the bank, you trade your foreign currency for US dollars, they'll take a little piece of that. They take a lot more for that than they would for just managing your huge fortune. So those foreign interest rates uh, commissions that they took at those banks is how he amassed all those millions and millions
Mm.
of charges that went to the bank. And it's another reason the bank was so complicit with him. They didn't want to lose a $60 million man. At one point, they called him that in their emails. They didn't want to lose a $60 million man from their balance sheet every year, which, it would be a huge hit for them if he wasn't their client.
Okay, we started this conversation with you saying that there was a connection, a financial connection between President Trump and Jeffrey Epstein, that they were friends. We know that. We know that a real estate deal was the breakup. They were bidding over a place, ironically called the House of Friends. And it was in Palm Beach, a waterfront property. And because Jeffrey Epstein got in a bidding war with Trump, who is famously cheap, he had to pay $46 million for a place that he ultimately flipped very shortly after to a Russian oligarch for $96 million. question mark a few years later. But I do want to ask you about this. And like, we don't have to talk necessarily about this real estate deal unless you think it's connected. But was there a financial relationship between Epstein and President Trump?
I believe so. I think that there was, and I think when I did in the first part of the Greatest Heist is I looked back at their entire financial network and how they how they both became quite rich. And, Jeffrey Epstein became rich by laundering and crashing these companies. He's a collapse expert, if you want to call him that. He'd go into companies and crash them, or build up their wealth and then crash them in order to take out the what some people call control fraud is the crime, in order to extract all the money out of it before that crash or after the crash. And he did it several times. That's what he did with Towers Financial, with Steve Hoffenberg or Tower Financial. But I think the Towers, I should say. Sorry, what was the question again? You were asking about the
I
how they made
asked if
the
there was
connection
any
to Trump. Yeah.
financial connections between Epstein and Trump. Yeah.
Now, it's understood, a lot of the money that he was laundering through Towers was Robert Maxwell's money, amongst others. It was also Adnan Khashoggi's money. It was also, probably, possibly Putin's money at some point, maybe not through Towers, but through later deals that he did in laundering things. So a lot of this money came from very wealthy people that he was laundering into through his company called J.E. Epstein. And as some of that money that came from Maxwell, at least, was part of this project that the KGB started before the end of the Soviet Union, which was about infecting American capitalism. The KGB had a lot of foreign assets. They put a lot of money outside of the country, and they did it partially through Robert Maxwell. He was the conduit that, parked all this money in the United States under various firms or everywhere else around the world. And
Well,
when,
he bought
when
media. Was that part of it? Was the
they,
buying of the media properties?
he did, but he also, Robert Maxwell ended up by bankrupting the Murrah Group pension fund, for example. That was
Yeah.
not just a bankruptcy because he wanted to collapse the company. He was stealing the money. He was stealing a
Right.
lot of money. He was worth way more at his death than he claimed. And he claimed he was, completely bankrupt, and he was not. And the person who would have known all those secrets and would have hidden all of that would have been Jeffrey Epstein, because Jeffrey Epstein, the part that they're sort of missing in his life, a lot of people is when he met Ghislaine in the 90s, or sorry, 80s. And that's where then he was first recruited to Israeli military intelligence by Robert Maxwell. Robert Maxwell was one of the people who recruited him.
Mm.
And so, if they were having this relationship or this friendship, whatever it was they were doing, but he was also working for Robert Maxwell. Hoffenberg told me, and various others have said to me, that he was cleaning up Robert Maxwell's files, this financial mess at the end. And maybe even before that, was working on behalf of Robert Maxwell learning a lot of the craft that he later brought to the United States. So the relationship between Ghislaine and Jeffrey was more of a partnership that took over the Robert Maxwell business.
Bonnie and Clyde.
Yeah, but he was working for the KGB. That's who he was working for.
Right.
It's not hard to see how all of those connections and all of that operation with all that entailed would have passed down to Ghislaine and to Jeffrey. So that's them. Donald Trump, we know, very heavily connected to Russian money as well. We had all the money through his condos were laundered Russian money. A lot of it, at least, was. His casinos were laundering Russian money. He's also connected to a KGB operation. The Krasnov thing that we know, plus many other things. So you've got a major KGB operation which was designed to take money out of Russia and pump it into the United States in order to destabilize the American capitalist system. And then they did that. They actually did that. And then you get to the House of Friendship, or La Maison l'Amitié, which was a Wexner property in Palm Beach. And Jeffrey always believed, I believe, that Donald Trump was financing the purchase of that house by Raboblev himself. So the person who landed up buying the property at the end from Donald Trump at $95 million, which was a $50 million profit, that person was Raboblev, the Russian oligarch, Raboblev, I think so you say it. And Jeffrey Epstein believed that he was also the person who financed Donald Trump to get that house from him. In I don't remember the exact year. It was 2004. I think that Trump first bought it, and then he sold it in 2008 for 95 million. Which is just to say that, there's Russian oligarchy money pouring into Donald Trump's world and also pouring into Epstein's world. Were they connected in other places? I believe that the bankruptcy that followed the 1996 casino bankruptcies, that they were also connected there. That
Mm.
and Michael Wolff said this the other night, that Jeffrey Epstein helped Donald Trump hide the money that he had suddenly after declaring bankruptcy, but then also emerged very quickly as a top Fortune 400 billionaire soon after he had those bankruptcies. Sorry, I'm getting very tangled up in all these details, but that's how the mind works when you spend so much time looking at these things.
I think for a long time, I mean, I did a podcast on Ghislaine Maxwell and her father, Robert. It's called Power the Maxwells. And I think like one of the things we were really trying to find out about was whether Robert introduced, Ghislaine to Epstein. It's something that's never, it's never been established like on the record by anyone. And it was interesting when she was asked during her interview with Todd Blanche, the Deputy Attorney General, that interview from this summer, whether there was a connection between her and her father. And it was the first, she had long denied that there was any connection at all between Robert and her father, but she seemed to hint that there was some connection in the interview. She said that he called both Jimmy Cohen and Ace Greenberg, I think at Bear Stearns, to ask what sort of guy Epstein was. And he said, but she claims they never met. But it's interesting that that she would even acknowledge that they had a connection, because for so long she was like, my father had no connection to Jeffrey Epstein, that she met him on her own. She shows up in New York broke, okay, after his death. And then suddenly Epstein, suddenly a year later, after living in a one-bedroom apartment, broke, as she would say, she ends up living in a luxurious townhouse paid for by Jeffrey Epstein. And also, she's filed in a case against his estate saying that he promised to provide for her financially for the rest of her life.
Yeah.
And you got to wonder why. I mean, was it just because she was grooming young girls for him, or grooming elites as well? I think she groomed elites. She brought a lot of really powerful people around him.
She was the network. He didn't know many people. She did, because of her father's work. I mean, for me, the story is very different, because I've understood the story to be that they met in the 80s, Ghislaine and Robert, but maybe even sooner, because in Jeffrey Epstein's 50th birthday book, there is a note there from one of the Bear Stearns executives saying that he had met Epstein at the same time as he was doing Bob Maxwell's account at Bear Stearns, which suggests, and then he also said, maybe you met the daughter, then his teenage daughter at the same time. He didn't say teenage daughter, but he said his daughter at the same time, which it suggests to me that, Jeffrey Epstein would have met Bob Maxwell or Robert Maxwell in the 70s almost. Did we lose you there? There you go. And 70s or early 80s. And then that he maybe met Ghislaine at a very early age, when she was still a teenager, potentially, which is also a little interesting, because Ari Ben Menashe told me that Robert Maxwell had the same interest in very young women as well. That maybe there's something connecting that between the two of them, Jeffrey Epstein and Robert Maxwell, and maybe Ghislaine was, in some ways, I don't want to say the word traffic, that's not the right word, but, we don't know how that relationship evolved and at what age and how that developed. And it's just too much to speculate about, obviously. But there's, potentially there was a very long connection there that existed from the 1980s all the way until, his death in 2019. So I think, do I believe that it was just her arriving broke? No, I think that was a cover story. I think their cover story the whole way through has been, I didn't know Robert Maxwell. I had no connection to Robert Maxwell. This is for Jeffrey Epstein. That she just, took the Concorde and arrived in his arms, in Jeffrey Epstein's arms, and it was a beautiful love story that just developed from there. I don't think anything like that. I think that made this scheme up to travel to America, to take Robert Maxwell's fortune, to take Robert Maxwell's operation, and then continue it in the United States under different circumstances. I'm curious to know from you whether this was ever did they did the survivors talk about the espionage at all? Was there ever an element that they knew that they were dealing with, that some of this was going to be not only blackmail, but also potentially sold or given to foreign intelligence agencies?
No. They knew that everything was being recorded because you could see that just from walking into the house. There were cameras everywhere. But they knew that there were cameras on everything. I think they knew as an adult when they were brought into the FBI, Virginia told me she was brought into the headquarters and shown bodies of young girls and older men, and she didn't recognize her body. She was like, I didn't see my own breasts or this or that. But she, no, I mean, they didn't know. I mean, they're kids.
Yeah, this is just, one of the things that is so daunting about this and so traumatizing for everybody in this case is how much wasn't known about Jeffrey to everybody. And it's almost re-traumatizing for them to go through these experiences and know all this new information, is
They
also,
loved him. A lot of them did.
yeah, I got that sense of that. I got this, a
He
lot
was
of
a
people
very
loved,
manipulative person. He was
he
very
was,
manipulative. You
and
couldn't
he hit
run
a
a
lot.
team like that.
Yeah, it really is. It's kind of shocking to think about. I know you told the story before of knocking on someone's door of the Virginia, and I think someone told Virginia you killed Jeffrey Epstein, that she was
Yeah.
responsible. A lot of the victims blamed for that.
They cared about him still this day. I mean, they would, when the FBI was trying to contact the girls to try to get, statements from them, victim statements, he told the girls that the police were coming for them because they were young prostitutes and that he would be generous enough to give them his lawyers. So
Yeah.
some of them took his lawyers. How would they know any better? They were kids, you know?
No, absolutely. I think that this is the survivors are such real victims of this, as we all are ultimately of the financial crimes. But these poor girls to be trafficked in that situation and then to be used in this way as pawns in a foreign um, espionage thing is so it's so depraved. It's so lacking of any humanity, and it's so and it might be the way things happen in intelligence communities. It might be how spy agencies work. It's certainly what you see glamorized in movies, but the reality of it is so harsh. The fact that they were lured into these situations without any knowledge of what was really going on is just so sad. It's just
Yeah.
it's daunting to think about. And no wonder they're out there all the time trying to complete the picture, trying to get the closure. Because for them, it's how do you get it to move on with your life if you don't know everything that happened during those years and how you used those years?
Okay, so I went to Davos World Economic Forum a few times as a journalist, and I was invited to Oleg Deripaska's parties
Mm,
twice, and or I crashed them kind of. And so he had the big party. He's a Russian oligarch, very close to Putin. They all are, obviously. And I remembered the first year, obviously World Economic Forum is where you have some of the most influential, wealthy people in the world at Davos in Switzerland. And, you see these like young, beautiful women kind of scantily clad dancing on these men, right? And, it was kind of a shocker to me. And then, people were like, well, yeah, that's sort of just a regular KGB kind of top, like that's a strategy to have something on these men, right? And you have to assume that the space is being filmed in some way. And then I went to it a second time, and who was it that was performing? Enrique Iglesias was performing the second time. And again, this time the girls were not as scantily clad because apparently there was a like complaint that uh they were too provocative. It was awkward for men there that were with their colleagues that were women or this and that. And so they sent them out looking like secretaries in like a, you know, button down shirt and like a tie and a skirt. And I was just like, I wouldn't know how old these girls were. They could have been very young, but it was all kind of, it felt like they were just being used as pawns in some sort of larger scheme. I mean, why else? Some people might say, okay, they want them there because it's nice to have beautiful women at a party, or are they being used for blackmail purposes?
The Russians are notorious for this. I mean, the Russian, Putin always likes to brag about how fantastic the prostitutes are in Russia, but it's because and how aware they are of that is because they run a lot of the prostitutes in Moscow and in other big cities there. It's a huge operation there for them to get information. Donald Trump, those supposed P tapes or whatever those tapes are, or
Mhm.
Leon Black when they went to that trip to Russia, Jeffrey Epstein probably when he went on that trip to Russia, they would all have been surveilled under enormous, and then also entrapped into these events. It's because it's not just, as you point out, the party you mentioned with Derek Pasca. It's not just prostitutes. It's an entire event where everybody is an operative. Everyone from the guests to the bar people to the girls. They were all digging for information. They were all trying to pull together some information on whatever clients they could get. This is how Russia operates, both internally and externally. So we know they do this to foreigners, but the way that Putin keeps his oligarchs close to him is through compromise. This is the thing he
Yeah,
does. He
that's all I
entraps
could think
them.
of, like, is compromise
Yeah. Yeah,
time.
just it's horrific to do this to people who are unsuspecting of it. I suspect the prostitutes in Russia know what they're doing. I think they know what the targets are.
Yeah.
They're operatives themselves, but um, in the United States, what they did is just completely something else with trafficking these young women in the way they did, and then the cases being dropped. As you pointed out, provided so much cover for Jeffrey Epstein to continue to do so many terrible things. It
Oh, yeah.
wasn't just the human trafficking that he continued to do, it was the financial criming that he kept doing. And one of the things I do in this new greatest heist is I explore, the relationship between JP Morgan and Jeffrey Epstein was so big and so momentous that when the 2008 crash happened, when that recession happened, there were two major parties involved, three major parties involved. The first part of it was Bear Stearns collapsing.
Mhm.
Bear Stearns, again, the same bank of Donald Trump, same bank of Robert Maxwell, the same bank of Jeffrey Epstein collapsing. And it was bought by whom? JP Morgan, by Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan. Now, it was a distressed sale that happened because of the collapse in the mortgage
Mhm.
market. That collapse in the mortgage market, as we reveal in the greatest heist, and I think I'm telling you this for the first time, is related to um, an offshore structure that Jeffrey Epstein managed worth $6 billion. In other words, he had the capacity to manipulate the market in order to crash Bear Stearns and also crash the economy down the line as a domino effect. And JP Morgan were there to pick it up. And this was all in 2008, right after that plea agreement, which makes you wonder what that plea agreement really
Well,
covers.
he would have been in jail, right, at the time?
He quit this chairmanship at 2007 of this offshore holding, so he wouldn't have been directly involved in that. But what he invested in two funds that Bear Stearns had in the same space. He invested $57 million into these funds, but just by pulling those $57 million, he could collapse those funds. Then he collapsed Bear Stearns. So if you're sophisticated enough to know how the dominoes fall, and if you have the network to know who the people are who are going to call the right people at the right time, you could engineer a crash of a market. And I think they did that several times. I think this network of foreign funded business people were engineering the crash of the American economy and the stock market on several occasions.
Wow. So it wasn't just a mortgage crisis with people over over extending
Well,
themselves.
it was. People weren't personally overextending themselves. The banks were loaning them ridiculously bad loans that were called liars loans. They were things that were just worth nothing, or they were dirty money that was being washed through
Yeah.
all these instruments, and people ended up being defrauded. I mean, Americans were fraudulently pushed into this crisis. Everyone
Yeah.
knew the crisis was going to happen. They triggered it, and then they managed themselves. Not a single banker went to jail. Not a single person in Wall Street
Yeah, I
went to
know.
jail for that crash. and millions of people lost their homes because of their fraudulent behavior. They basically lied their way through that entire crisis. So now add on top of that, you've got Jeffrey Epstein, of all people, as one of the key figures who helps trigger this, and one of the key figures who facilitates the sale of Bear Stearns to JP Morgan, which means only Bear Stearns was saved. Every other financial firm, like the Lehman Brothers, and we would know what happened to
Mhm.
others, but it's Bear Stearns that got the save early on. Why Bear Stearns? You come back to the same question of Maxwell, Epstein, Trump, all being clients of the same place.
Yeah, it is interesting that that was the place that even Glenn Maxwell mentioned Bear Stearns. I have to go back to Stephen Hoffenberg, who was his, I would say, partner, right, at
Yeah.
Financial Powers. He spent the rest of his life in prison for the largest Ponzi scheme in the world at that time. It was close to $400 million.
Mhm.
Jeffrey Epstein, according to Vicky Ward, was an informant 3 times to the FBI on that case. It
Mhm.
seems to me, and I believe he also helped them in Bear Stearns, but I'm not sure Bear Stearns case. Uh, do
That
you
rings a
think that?
bell.
Do you think that the why do you think the Department of Justice protected Epstein? Uh, not looking at the money laundering, not looking at the sex trafficking. Do you think it was because they saw him to be a valuable um, source, a valuable witness, or they saw him to be someone who gave them great tips or helped them in cases, that he cooperated, he was, or an asset in some ways? Or do you think it was because they had this relationship with Israel and they felt that they had to maintain that because of his connections with the.
Yeah. I think as well, it may have had a lot to do with the prince.
Mm,
He was the subject of that case, and if they were aware of all of this, the royal family would have done, and certainly Prince Andrew, not even the royal family, they would have
mm,
done a lot to try and influence it. And I know a lot of the survivors felt that that was the case, that that the fact that you had a royal member of the royal family compromised in this way would hold huge sway with the president and anyone in the government, because of course no one wants to go up against the royal family. It's certainly not something one wants to do willingly. So I think that's one of the things that broke the Justice Department. I think they would have probably helped. They would have figured out the CIA stuff. They would have figured out the intelligence stuff, and they would have figured out another way to get him to stop what he was doing. That's what counterintelligence is all about. But I think once you've got the royal family attached to this, it's very
mm,
difficult. And I'm not sure if Epstein went after Prince Andrew for that precise reason, knowing that that would be the ultimate card to play if anything ever happened to him, because he could say, "Yeah, but I've got Andrew." Um, you know, that could be. It could be. I don't know. It's speculation, but it's something that makes me wonder a lot of the time about why they dropped that. Because other than that, there was you know, it was not in the national security interests of the United States. It was not in the economy's interest. It was not in anyone's interest to allow this to continue the way it did, because, it really gave us Donald Trump. This whole network that Jeffrey Epstein cultivated is the same network that helped Donald Trump become president in 2016.
So, Zev, for some of my followers who don't know you, can you just give them a little bit of your history? I mean, we've thrown out a lot of possibilities, right? A lot of this is really hard to confirm. And I think it's the difficulty of covering Jeffrey Epstein is that it's hard to get like a second source or a third source on a lot of it. It all seems to be, it seems to make sense. It seems to stack up. But some things we can point to an email or we can point to a financial transaction. But then it's kind of like the gray area in between where it's hard to really kind of connect the dots. And that's why I think the Epstein story can fall into conspiracy land. Of course, a lot of the connections that we've laid out between Jeffrey Epstein and President Trump, he denies them, right? He doesn't deny that they were friends, but he would deny that there is a Russia connection and that they were committing financial crimes together. But and the fact and any sort of sex trafficking. But you know, can you sort of explain to our listeners, like, how you came to believe a lot of this information?
Firstly, I'm a journalist. I'm a political journalist. I'm a TV executive producer. I've produced network morning news around the world, including at
Right.
CBS News. I mean, this is not something I wanted to seek out. It is something I landed up seeking out because I was curious about the Donald Trump story. I did not understand how Donald Trump was elected in 2016, and um, at that time, I was trying to launch this independent venture of doing something like I'm doing now with live streaming online about the news. And I started it off by writing a blog about Donald Trump and Russia. And I did a weekly thing on Narrative that basically exploded the Trump Russia narrative, and it became quite popular at the time. And that led me to Jeffrey Epstein. I at one point I saw an article by a press release from Hoffenberg, and I had a
Mm.
number on it. I said, well, I'm going to give him a call, talk to him. And
Yeah.
and what he did is he really gave me so many new avenues of investigation. And I just, I'm a curious journalist, and I just want to go down these
Hmm.
paths. This has turned out to be, a 6-year thing for me now, where I've covered Jeffrey Epstein so closely, and Donald Trump so closely. But for me, I've always looked at it from a political, economic, financial crime perspective, because there was so much coverage of the survivors, and that was taking up so much of the space around Epstein. I thought there was a really unexplored territory to go down. How do we know that these things really happen? We'll probably never be able to figure everything out, but we do know. I got it from two sources: from Ari Ben Menashe, who was um, Robert Maxwell's handler,
Hmm.
and co-conspirator in Iran Contra, and he worked for Israeli military intelligence at the time. And Steve Hoffenberg confirmed this, and various others have confirmed this not on the record, that Epstein did work for Israeli military intelligence.
Mm.
And we also
Huge
know,
to have that, if you have that on the record from,
yeah,
and they're reliable sources.
I believe that they're reliable. I believe everything that Hoffenberg says. A lot of people dismiss him.
He's in jail for a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, there's good reason to question him because he's got a
Yeah.
criminal record. But on the other hand, he had so much to lose by coming out with all this information afterwards, and really nothing to gain. I don't think I don't know how much money
I
he
think
had.
he's like very angry at Jeffrey too, though, for because of the fact that he took the fall.
Yeah, but
You
he could have
think?
just asked for money or something. He could have gone into he could have said, just make me whole, give me,
Yeah.
make my life better. He didn't. He supported the survivors, and I believe his efforts were genuine. Maybe he was trying to get it for himself. I don't know, but his efforts seem pretty genuine to me. And everything he said has checked out. There's not a single thing that he told me, and I did, maybe 50 on the record interviews with him.
Wow.
And I ran all this, before, while he was still alive. I was developing this understanding of this whole world, and I ran it past him, and we went through it in great detail. Actually, a lot of the stuff, and he confirmed it. So it's not. He's just one person with one viewpoint, but a lot of others have corroborated all of this over the years, and the more people start to understand it as a financial crime network, and you start looking at all the possibilities around what that is, it sort of makes sense. It's the only thing that really makes
It's
sense.
also
I
a
mean,
really easy thing to confirm if the government wanted to. Like you can look
yes,
at transactions, you can subpoena banks, you can. It's not a hard thing to confirm.
yes,
Sex crimes are harder. This is an easier.
very. Yeah,
And
these suspicious activity reports that have been coming out. I mean, these
yeah.
are those are billions
And
of
yet it was
dollars.
deferred. It was deferred. Alex Costa said, "Don't go down that rabbit hole."
Yeah,
And it
I
wasn't
believe.
even a real rabbit hole. It was pretty easy money laundering. People go to jail for money laundering all the time.
Yeah, and it's very easy to prove, as you point out. And I
Yeah.
think the prosecutor had a very good, compelling case, and she didn't want to drop it. But they packaged all this, the plea agreements into one package deal, which got them all off the hook, which is a brilliant thing to happen. And then just before the financial crisis, which was a huge crime that they were undertaking. So, hey,
Yeah.
Dean, how you doing, Dean? We'll see you later at 3 o'clock.
Yeah, I may have to jump because it's
Hey, Lee.
clock is going to be 1 p.m. Eastern time over here.
All right,
Thank you guys. This was fabulous. I feel like I've learned a lot. And
you
thank
too.
you so much, Seb. And it's great to meet all of your followers who are very much also interested in a similar probably one of the biggest corruption stories of my lifetime, at the very least.
I think it's really the biggest criminal, story of the last 100 years, if not more, if not the greatest heist ever, which is why I call it that. And to everyone who's watching, everyone should really subscribe to Tara's incredible Substack. She does incredible work and has done incredible work with all the survivors and every aspect of this Epstein caper.
Thank you.
You really did an amazing job, Tara, and thank you very much for all
Thank you. You
the
too.
service you do to the community for that. Thank you.
No, thank you. Appreciate all of your hard work and reporting. And I mean, that's how I believe ultimately it'll be journalists and whistleblowers who will reveal this story. I don't think the government will be the ones to hand over
Yeah, it's
the
going to be really interesting. It's going to be interesting if they release the files. We'll see what happens now if they shut down. We'll see if that happens.
if it ends ever. Okay,
Thanks,
bye
Tara. Thank
everyone.
you. Bye,
See you.
everybody.